Library, I came across this book, Prose for Discussion. It's an anthology by E.W. Buxton. And in that, on page 19, I came across Eric Nichole's essay on Canada Explained. It is characteristic of his wit, humor, and intellectual rebel. To him, rather, as he said, every activity known to man is worthy subject of jest, and that could be history too, and that's what. Let me read a little, and you will see. So, history of Canada from the humorist, Vancouver humorist Eric Nichole. So I'm just reading a few lines from here to let you know he's hilarious. So he's divided his entire essay into prehistoric Canada, such as it was. Then he talks about Canada discovered awkwardly, and another title he's written, the French versus the English. Then the reason for Ottawa he talks about in his essay, the Revolting Colonies. Then he also talks about the War of 1812, 1813, 1814, etc. he writes. Then Return of Louis Riel. Then he talks about the arts in Canada. And that's it. So let me just begin. As you can see on the screen, let's just start with prehistoric Canada, such as it was. Prehistoric Canada covers the period of everything before Bruce Hutchinson, before the coming of man, and more important women. Canada was a large area inhabited only by buffalo and ice ages. Later, the buffalo found that they weren't actually buffalo at all, but bison. Whereupon they became extinct. More recently, the bison or buffalo have made a dramatic comeback thanks to a rough training program and plenty of road work, so that they are now so plentiful they have to be shot. They may become extinct again, he writes. The first humans to come to Canada were the Indians. There is some mystery as to where the Indians came from. Some experts say that they came from the same place as the Eskimo. This doesn't help much because nobody knows where the Eskimo came from either, except the Eskimo, and they aren't talking. Equally mysterious were the series of ice ages that covered Canada with giant glaciers, which in turn receded into the Arctic. Thus, Canada was one of the first countries to have automatic defrosting. The chief characteristics of an ice age was that the huge flux of ice ground down everything in its path and drove the inhabitants south. Today, this feature of Canadian life is provided by income tax. So then he writes about Canada discovered awkwardly. So here he writes, the first white explorer to reach Canada was Eric the Red. So then he talks about other Scandinavians trying to sail across the Atlantic had failed, but Eric the Red was a Norse of a different color. It is sometimes asked how it was that Eric the Red landed in Canada, but with a name like that, he had a fat chance of landing in the States. Thanks to the description of Canada that Eric took home, nobody else tried to discover Canada for several hundred years. The next wave of explorers were led by Christopher Columbus, who sailed west in an attempt to find a new route to the east. This was a typical government project. When Columbus landed in America, he assumed that it was India. Fortunately, he was wrong, as this would have made Canada Tibet and discouraged pretty well all the tourists except Lowell Thomas. After Columbus discovered America for Spain, the King of France, Louis Roy, ordered the explorers to go out and discover something. The thrones of France and Spain hated each other at the time because of intermarriage. The first French explorer to reach Canada was Jacques Cartier, later immortalized in Frere Jacques in Quebec national anthem. All the French explorers landed at the Gaspé because it was so picturesque. They planted the flag of France and called it New Scotland. The first English explorer to reach Canada was Jock Cabot, but he forgot to bring a flag. By the time he went back for it, he was too late to claim anything but his pension. The next great English explorer was Henry Hudson, who was still looking for India. Hudson sailed into a large body of water and proved that it was a mistake. He gave his name to this bay, which became the name of a large Canadian retail store. Advertisement era. About this time, Lloyd's of London, the great maritime insurance firm anxious to encourage British shipping, conducted their I Discovered a Continent contest with first prize of a free floater policy. Nobody took them up, however, till Captain Cook, who showed a good deal of originality by trying to find a route back from India. Meanwhile, the French explorer Champlain was working his way up the St. Lawrence, having had the typically French idea of starting a colony with the help of his wife, Madame Champlain. To help them, the king sent ships with cargoes of brides. This was the golden age of Canadian longshoring. The Frenchmen who took the brides were called seigneurs because they were too busy meeting the boats to do any work. The seigneurs became the ruling class, and every spring had the privilege of falling through the ice first. Then he writes, the French versus the English. Eventually, the French fur traders paddling down river started meeting the English fur traders paddling upriver, and both sides realized that there weren't enough gullible Indians to go round. The result was that the French began a campaign of pillaging British forts. Where there was no fort for the French to pillage, the British built one. This war went on for more years than anybody cares to remember. Owing to the long distances, the armies had to march to meet defeat. However, the British at last outwitted the French by sending back to the old country more than the French had. As these men started arriving by ship, the war became a struggle between the French and the British. Struggle between French arms and the British customs. And he goes on. So I'm going to read a little ahead now. The reason for Ottawa. Noticing the capital of Canada kept changing back and forth from Quebec to Toronto every 4 years, Queen Victoria ordered that it should be nailed down to Ottawa. The Queen did not notice, of course, that the site was close to a large match factory and therefore bound to burn down sooner or later when it did. However, the Canadian government accepted her decision since it was the only time Her Majesty had given Canada any capital without charging interest. Also, Ottawa combined the respectability of being in Ontario with the desirability of being able to get into Quebec before the pubs closed. Then he talks about the birth of a notion. Meanwhile, having become more charming than ever, Sir John Macdonald was leaning towards a confederation of Canada and the maritime provinces. To persuade the different leaders that this was a good idea, he arranged a series of conferences in different places, such as Quebec, London, and Charlottetown. These proceedings were nearly upset by the tragic shooting in the Yukon of D.R.C. Macro, a brilliant Irish-Canadian oracle. However, Macdonald pressed his Union unit with vigor. At last he had everybody around the same long table and informed them that, by the grace of Her Majesty, they were all fathers, the fathers of Confederation. To celebrate the occasion, all the new fathers crossed their legs and had their photo taken. The date of the historic occasion was July 1st, 1867, which is the only date in Canadian history. Still wreaking charm, Macdonald went to London and helped the Queen choose a name for the newborn country settling on Canada, because that was what it was called. They also chose the motto, a marry whisk and marry, or a little water with that whiskey. One by one, the other colonies of Canada joined the Confederation just as soon as they could see their way clear to getting more out of it than they were putting into it. Then he writes about the revolting colonies. Around this time, whatever it was, the British colonies became restless and dumped a shipload of tea into Boston Harbor. This led to the American Revolution and also explains how Americans make tea. Before, the colonies had been restless very long under George Washington. They noticed that Canada was closer for attack than the mother country, and the going was drier underfoot. They therefore dispatched several expeditions of small troops, Minutemen, specially chosen for their ability to march all winter without soles on their boots. These revolting Americans attacked Canada unfairly, hitting below the border where possible. The governor of Canada, a guy named Carleton, was obliged to leave his college and offer resistance. He called upon French inhabitants, but they weren't home. As usual, the redcoats were a better target than the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont. To that, once again, the British were obliged to advance backwards until the fleet arrived. The Americans did in fact capture Montreal, where they were warmly welcomed by the English residents. This so confused the Americans that Carleton had time to call upon the French habitants again. They were still out to lunch. Since this was longer than Carleton could wait, he decided to retire bodily to Quebec. Fortunately, many of the Americans had signed on to fight for 1 year only, so that the Canadian garrison was able to take an impressive toll of expired contracts. Backed by the British fleet, Carleton chased the Americans back across the border and became the hero who had saved Canada from independence. However, he had been very disappointed with the way the French inhabitants had failed to take advantage of the privilege of having been conquered by the British, refusing to sell food to the Americans only after the Americans ran out of cash and tried to pass checks. Carleton went home to England in a huff, the favorite means of transportation of British governors at the time. According to the Treaty of Paris, France, both sides in the war agreed on a border between the two countries drawn so that no matter where train or bus passengers crossed, the immigration men would be able to wake them up in the middle of the night. The War of 1812, 13 and 14, etc., he writes. The War of 1812 was caused by land-hungry Americans who looked west and saw the savage Indians, looked north and saw the peaceful Canadians, and agreed that Canada was ripe for emancipation. Since Britain was busy fighting a war with Napoleon, the Americans also had reason to believe that the Canadians' only successful strategy in war, the arrival of the British fleet, was weakened. They therefore set out to shoot Canada free. He writes that a few Canadians and Indians under General Brock, later known as the Brockbusters, chose to fight for continued tyranny, which proved a nasty shock for those members of the American force who had been promised only a military parade through attractive countryside with French girls throwing kisses and a favorable rate of exchange for their dollar. Before the Americans could rally, the War of 1812 had been held over to 1813. For the American, 1813 was one of the worst years of the War of 1812, though not as bad as the following year, 1814. An expeditionary force attempted to surprise the Canadians at the Beaver Dams, but the Canadians had been warned of their approach by Laura Secord, who knew the beavers personally and made her way alone through 20 miles of pathless forest and past American sentries. But for this courageous action of Laura Secord, Canadians today would be eating Martha Washington's chocolates. By 1814, the British had defeated Napoleon, and the inevitable British fleet arrived in Canada. With their shipping and trade cut off and Washington burning, the Americans gave up their attempts to liberate Canada. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, France. Now we're talking about, he writes about return of Louis Riel. Saskatchewan, which hadn't had its rebellion yet and was resentful, now broke out in hostile half-breeds. The half-breeds were self-conscious about losing their land and not being baptized. They therefore sent for Louis Riel, who was making a comeback in the States. After being hanged, Riel had been elected to Parliament but was disqualified on... I couldn't much understand this, so just let me end with the essay that he writes, The Arts in Canada. The arts have been flourishing in Canada, a glorious explosion of talent of which this present volume is only one of the more obvious examples. The group of 7 has been succeeded by the group of 11, a 57% increase in less than a generation. For the first time, Canadian artists have something in the bag, a mural. Despite the temporary setback of Canadian verse, when the CNR repainted the walls of its washrooms, poetry in the country continues to thrive. Poetry is not only being written by René Macpherson, Dudek, and Klein, but it's being read by Klein, Dudek, Macpherson, and Rennie. As for the theatre, huge new temples of Thespis have been erected in Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver, as well as Stratford. These have opened the golden age of souvenir programs as never before. Canadians are anxious to be seen at the theatre. Some of them even go inside where the seats are and watch whatever it is that the management has chosen as a conversation piece for intermission. Other countries are producing better plays, but Canada is second to none in distinguished intermissions, he writes. Canada ever growing, and Canada is growing. This country has the highest birth rate of all the industrialized nation. Either that or it has the lowest birth rate of all the backward nations. Whichever way we look, it is the land of opportunity. So whichever way we look at it, this is the land of opportunity. Indeed, it was really entertaining, very witty, very humorous, and if you know a little bit of history, you'll enjoy it. That's what Eric Nichole, go through his books or listen to him on YouTube. He's got a great sense of humor.